Okay, the last chapter in part 3 looks at a general theory of delinquency, which is often referred to as general theory of crime. So let's start with an overview. So let's start with those major direct causes of individual delinquency. Remember, we talked about 4 clusters: irritability and low self control, poor parenting, negative school experiences, and association with delinquent peers and gang members. These causes are related to all the major delinquency theories. Remember, we've talked before that just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other, right? But there are some reciprocal effects here, right? And they affect each other. So delinquency affects the clusters affect delinquency. And then both biological factors and the larger social environment affect the clusters as well. So you can see here how the general theory of crime is trying to come up with a theory that describes and can explain all criminal behavior. And you can see how this is going to be a little bit complex. So let's start with a review of theories and research. So remember, we talked about strain theory. Strain theory focuses on strain that we experience, stressful life events. We talked about 2 major types of strain: either the failure to achieve goals that you have, or the loss of something positive or presentation of something negative. Strain leads to negative emotions, and in particular when that emotion is anger, delinquency is often used as an effort to cope with strain. Social learning theory focuses on our associations with other people. They may provide beliefs favorable to delinquency for us, model and reinforce that delinquency. Control theory focuses on what stops delinquency, and it talks about direct control, stakes in conformity, and internal controls. And then labeling theory focuses on what happens once someone is labeled delinquent. They're often rejected and treated in a harsh manner, and that often increases delinquency. We also talked about life course theories, right? When we look at patterns of offending over the life course. And we talked about adolescent limited offenders. Their offending starts in mid-adolescence and tapers off and stops. Life course persistent offenders start at an earlier age and continue offending into adulthood. We also talked about situations that are conducive to delinquency. Is the juvenile provoked? Are drugs and alcohol present? And then also attractive targets, the lack of capable guardians, and the presence of delinquent peers. When we talked about research, we talked about individual traits, family and school experiences, characteristics of schools, delinquent peers, and then in the last chapter, we just talked about religion, work, media, drugs, and guns. So how do we put this together for a general theory of crime? So the general theory says that there are major direct causes of individual delinquency, and they're grouped into 4 clusters: irritability and low self-control. This makes you lower in internal control and higher in strain. It also means you learn to engage in crime and may often be labeled as bad and treated in a harsh, rejecting manner. Poor parenting practices are often related to high strain, low indirect control, and low stake in conformity. Again, there's modeling of aggressive behavior, and parents often label the child as bad and treat them in a harsh, rejecting manner. The third cluster is negative school experiences. This creates a lot of strain and reduces stake in conformity and direct control. Delinquent peers increase our strain, reduce direct control and stakes in conformity. They foster social learning of crime, increase the likelihood of being labeled as bad, and increase the time spent in unstructured, unsupervised activities. So how are they related? As I mentioned earlier, there are reciprocal effects here. So one impacts the other, and then that one impacts the first one. So problems in one cluster tend to create problems in other clusters. Each cluster in turn influences the effect of other clusters on delinquency. So for example, delinquent peer associations condition the effect of poor parenting practices. Delinquency also impacts those clusters, and prior delinquency often directly increases the likelihood of subsequent delinquency. This is most likely when others are labeled as bad, and that can be conditioned by the juvenile's prior standing in clusters. Prior delinquency also increases the likelihood of subsequent delinquency, especially if it hasn't been sanctioned or detected. And delinquents find delinquent behaviors beneficial in certain ways. We also have background factors that are going to impact the clusters. You remember we talked about biological factors and social environment. For biological factors, we talked about what we might inherit genetically and any biological harms we may have experienced. Social environment is going to include things like our community, our position in the larger society in terms of gender, age, and class. Class coming, of course, from our parents' social class. Relationships between race and ethnicity, and larger social influences such as the economy. So we also know there's some differences in offending over the life course. So why are some juveniles just adolescent limited offenders and some are life course persistent offenders? We know that social and biological changes associated with adolescence affect the four clusters, and that's probably why we see some offending in adolescence. What makes somebody a life course persistent offender is the development of traits of irritability, low self-control, and experiencing poor parenting early in life. Those are traits that continue then through adulthood, and that's why we see that offending continue. So group differences in delinquency, why some groups are more prone to delinquency than others, could be explained by the fact that some groups may score higher on those clusters. So one thing we can do is perhaps we can use this general theory of crime to explain why men offend at higher rates than women. Well, perhaps males are higher in irritability and low self-control. And there is evidence for this biologically. There are sex-related differences in temperament at birth, and we see differences based on sex and physical aggression early in life. Historical studies and cross-cultural studies, where we look at different cultures, consistently find males more involved in physical aggression. And some of this is probably due to genetic inheritance and differences in testosterone and hormone levels. As for environmental factors, how we socialize men and women are going to play a role. Men are socialized to be aggressive, assertive, risk takers, independent, and competitive. Women are socialized to be dependent, empathetic, supportive, and peacemakers. There's also gender differences in other clusters. If you think back to how closely you were supervised as an adolescent, and if you have siblings of the opposite sex, you might find that men are less closely supervised by and attached to family members. Boys in their teen years are less attached to school, spend less time on schoolwork, and don't do as well in school, and they're more likely to associate with delinquent peers. For women, we also know that sexual abuse plays a special role in explaining their serious offending. So a lot of female juvenile delinquents might get caught from running away from home, but they're often running away from sexual abuse. They often then turn to crime for survival methods. So this is why we see them more involved in prostitution, selling drugs, and petty thefts. This then can lead to further abuse and exploitation. When these teens are found, they're then often arrested and returned home, and if home is an abusive place, then they may experience further abuse. So let's review this general theory. There are major direct causes of delinquency are grouped into four clusters, right? And they affect delinquency by increasing strain, reducing control, fostering social learning of crime, and increasing labeling. These clusters then have reciprocal effects on one another, and each cluster impacts other clusters. Engaging in delinquency impacts the clusters, and we also know that biological factors in the social environment also impact that. And that wraps up our general theory of crime.